Hi, I'm Mike Bush.
I'm Paul New.
And I'm Colleen Sterling. Welcome to Ask the A&Ps from AOPA.
This is where you try to stump us with your thorniest maintenance question. So if you have one of those, please email it to us at podcasts@aopa.org for a chance to get on the show.
Please follow or subscribe to be alerted when any new show comes out so you can get into all those little prickly questions.
And if you'd like to get on our mailing list, we've been sending out quite a bit of email lately, including something we're going to be talking about today. But the easiest way to get on our mailing list is to text the word SAVVY, SAVVY, to 33777. And your smartphone will ask you for your name and email address, and it will get you on our list. So that's text SAVVY, SAVVY, to 33777 to put yourself on our mailing list.
So lots of big news this week.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I've been spending pretty much most of the last 2 weeks of my life fighting with the FAA at its highest levels, which is one of my favorite things to do.
They love you, Mike.
Now, most of the time over the decades when I've engaged in a big fight with the FAA, it's been over an AD. But This one was something different, and it seems pretty serious unless we can get it corrected. And basically, this all started when on September 3rd, the FAA issued a memorandum, which we are calling the MOSS interpretation, MOSS. And what happened was a guy by the name of Jonathan Moss, who is the head of the Little Rock FSDO, sent a letter to the Office of Chief Counsel of the FAA asking for an interpretation of one of the regulations. And for some reason, it took the FAA 26 months to get back to him, but they finally got back to him on September 3rd with an interpretation that is extremely defective, and unless it is rescinded or changed radically, is going to stand the maintenance industry on its ear.
Yeah.
It's nice it took so long to come up with
the regulation that we're talking about is FAR 43.3, and specifically subparagraph D of 43.3. 43.3 is the regulation that says who's allowed to work on certificated aircraft, who's allowed to do maintenance on certificated aircraft. And it's got a lot of subparagraphs that list pretty much all of the usual suspects. And it says Part 145 repair stations can do maintenance on certificated aircraft. A&P mechanics can do that. Part 121 airlines can do it. Part 135 operations, if they have an in-house maintenance operation, can do it. Repairmen working for a repair station can do maintenance. And that's kind of all the obvious stuff that it says. But then it has two interesting paragraphs, one of which we all know and love, which says that aircraft owners who have pilot's licenses but don't have mechanic certificates are allowed to do preventive maintenance on an aircraft that they own, as long as that aircraft isn't used for commercial purposes. And then there's one final subparagraph, which is the one that's in question here, and that's subparagraph D of 43.3. And that says that anybody can do maintenance on a certificated aircraft, even if you don't hold a certificate. as long as you're doing it under the supervision of an A&P mechanic. So 43.3D talks about supervised maintenance, maintenance by non-mechanics working under the supervision of a mechanic. And this affects us in a bunch of different ways. First of all, most of us who are A&Ps got our A&Ps by apprenticing at some point and gaining the requisite experience. The FAA requires 30 months of hands-on maintenance work on aircraft in order to qualify to take the A&P test. So most A&Ps started as apprentices working under the supervision of an A&P in order to get the hours necessary to earn their own A&P. The second way it affects us is when owners want to work on their own aircraft and go beyond just doing preventive maintenance, where they basically want to do more than that, but do it under the supervision of their mechanic. So owner-assisted annuals are a really good example of cases where owners will work on their own airplanes under the supervision of their A&P. And it's 43.3D that makes that a legal thing to do. So, so getting back to our friend Jonathan Moss at the Little Rock FSDO, the question he posed to the Office of General Counsel was whether the supervision by a mechanic of a non-certificated person, an apprentice or aircraft owner or whatever, whether that could be done using things like Zoom and FaceTime and closed circuit TV and other, electronic means, or whether it had to be done with the mechanic physically present to do the supervision. Because this regulation was written 60 years ago when none of the technology that we now take for granted existed. So doing things remotely wasn't possible until fairly recently, but now everybody does stuff remotely. We're doing something right now kind of remotely. So
pretty remote.
So that's the question that Moss posed. But the response that came 26 months later, that came in this FAA memo on September 3rd, went way beyond the question that Jonathan Moss asked, and really put a major fly in the ointment, or cherry bomb in the toilet, or whatever the right metaphor is. So I think the best way to explain this is, first of all, is to talk briefly about what 43.3D says. And 43.3D says, and I'm going to paraphrase it because I'm not looking at the regulation right now, but it says an uncertificated person working under the supervision of a certificated mechanic can do anything that the supervisor is permitted to do, with the exception of inspections. You can't. An uncertificated person can't do an annual or 100-hour inspection under supervision. Only a mechanic can do the inspection. But anything else that the mechanic is allowed to do, the trainee is allowed to do, the apprentice is allowed to do, under two conditions. And the two conditions have always seemed very, very common sense, and they've remained pretty much the same for the last 60 years. And the two conditions are, first of all, it says the supervisor must personally observe the work to the extent necessary to ensure that it is done properly. So that says that the supervisor has a proactive responsibility for oversight of the work, but it gives him broad discretion as to what that oversight is going to be. If the work involved is riveting up a repair on a wing, the supervisor might say, well, I want to watch you do the first dozen rivets, and if you seem to know what you're doing, then I'll let you just do the rest of it and call me when you're done, and I'll inspect all the rest of your work. And if I don't like anything that we see, we'll have to drill some of them out. But the supervisor has broad discretion as to how much supervision is necessary, and he's got a lot of incentive to supervise the work appropriately, because 43.3 allows an uncertificated person to do the work, but it doesn't allow an uncertificated person to approve the work. It's the supervisor who signs the logbook entry, and it's the supervisor who's responsible for the outcome. Then the second condition is that the supervisor shall be readily available in person for consultation. So that's kind of the reactive requirement that says if the apprentice gets stuck at any point, or if the apprentice has a question at any point, he has to be able to reach his supervisor and get whatever coaching or assistance he needs. So again, the two conditions are that the supervisor must personally observe the work to the extent necessary to ensure that it's being done properly, and must be readily available in person for consultation. That's what the regulation says. And it's always seemed like a very reasonable regulation. And it gives supervisors pretty broad discretion as to how much supervision is required in any particular case. So Moss was asking what personally observes the work means. And it said, does that mean that your eyeballs have to physically be on it, or can you use an iPhone camera or a borescope or a FaceTime call or any of the knowledge projecting technologies that we have now? And the memo that came back said, no, you can't use any of those technologies. You have to have your eyeballs on the work in order to personally observe it. Now, that's sort of a kind of a stupid interpretation in the 21st century.
You really feel.
I mean, especially given that probably half the FAA workforce is working remotely now.
Yeah. And some of the mechanic Facebook groups are using terms much more colorful.
Well, I know this is a family show, but look, we're in a world right now where surgeons are doing robotic surgery remotely from the operating room, where warfare is being conducted remotely with drones from somebody who is halfway around the world from where the attack is being conducted. And where half the FAA staff is working remotely. They started doing that during COVID, and they've never stopped. And they're doing things remotely you wouldn't even expect that they could do remotely, like doing inspections of Part 145 repair stations. I have a friend that runs an avionics shop, and his last inspection from his principal maintenance inspector was done via Zoom. The guy that never showed up.
Can I interject and make a point, a devil's advocate point, just to kind of break this conversation up, because we've been listening to Mike get very angry about this Moss interpretation. So I agree. We're doing a lot of things remotely, but when I do an inspection, I not only look, I touch. So I think there is an aspect of inspecting that involves reaching in and manipulating or touching.
But
Colleen, we're not talking about inspecting.
Yeah.
But you're asking,
and inspecting is the one thing that a mechanic can't delegate.
I understand that, but you are asking the person who's the authorized person to approve or say that work looks okay, and you might lose something if you can't touch. That's all I'm saying. just like inspections. You lose something if you can't touch it. But I still think that we should be able to do this remotely. I'm just.
I agree, Colleen, and I think most inspectors, I mean, most supervisors would at one point want to be physically present, at least at the end of the process. When they're doing a final inspection
during the
decide
inspection,
whether to approve it.
Yeah.
Yes.
And some kinds of work you have to inspect before the end, because the final steps of it covers it up, you know.
Right.
And the inspectors have, you know, the supervisors have this very strong incentive to do whatever is right to make sure that it's done right, because if something goes wrong, it's on them. It's not on
they always do.
apprentice,
of course.
you know. So
I'm not disagreeing with that.
Okay, so there are two parts of this Moss interpretation memo. The first part said you can't supervise remotely, which seems kind of stupid, because if the reg says that the mechanic has discretion to determine how much supervision is required, he ought to have discretion as to what means he uses to supervise it too.
Yep.
Totally.
But at any rate, it has a prohibition against using electronic means to supervise. Okay, but that's not the real showstopper. That's not why we're all wrapped around the axle. That's just stupid, but it's not catastrophic. What's catastrophic is that this interpretation says that readily available in person for consultation means that the mechanic must be present and looking for errors and be prepared to take over anytime something is going awry.
Like flying an airplane would suddenly have to jump in and take the controls.
Yeah, which basically would mean that the mechanic to be supervising would have to be glued to the supervisee, wouldn't be able to do anything else. And if the supervisor needs to go to the bathroom, he would have to tell the supervisor, stop work, I have to go to the bathroom, don't do anything till I get back. I mean, it would be really ridiculous.
Yes.
Well, and the reality is on so many fronts. So being someone that owns a shop and has 2 trainees at the moment. Yes, and they're out there. I'm not standing next to them.
Oh my God.
Don't tell the FAA, but I'm not standing next to them as they work. I find it, so to me, I think this interpretation could have gone the other way and said, oh yeah, electronic means works really well, provided that that to the extent necessary includes that the supervisor goes and does the touchy-feely when it's needed. I think that could have been just as easy, because in 1963, when they wrote this originally, the regulation, they had no concept of what we could do later. So it's upsetting that the interpretation took the exact opposite tack. The other thing is you talk about in-progress inspections. So spark plugs, that's a maintenance, it's preventive maintenance, but it's a maintenance thing. So when Austin is out here doing spark plugs, how many times do I have to observe him doing spark plug cleaning? Do I need to stand next to him while he cleans all 12? And gaps, can I not just check it after the fact? Because nothing's going to happen during the process that I need to see. I showed him once. And oh, by the way, just to be careful about this, and the list of people that could do preventive maintenance includes the pilot owner, who miraculously is born with the ability to do all of this work with 0 training and 0 supervision. The FAA says that the aircraft owner that's a rated pilot for that airplane can go change a tire.
Wow.
No training whatsoever. He can do this. He or she can take the spark plugs out and clean them. No supervision. But mechanics, we all know, are apparently not born with that ability. and apparently are not smart enough to do things without direct supervision 24/7. Sorry. I'm looking for my soapbox. I wasn't standing on it yet.
Paul, you're digressing slightly
Sorry.
from 43.3D.
Well,
getting
except
into-
that 43.3D, in the way it was interpreted, makes no sense when you compare it to the other things. So it's just so off base. It just drives me nuts.
So anyway, this was a dumb interpretation. But the worst part of the interpretation was not the prohibition on using electronic devices for supervision, but it was this notion that the supervisor has to be constantly watching for errors and prepared to take over, which basically would mean he'd have to be glued to the trainee and joined at the hip. And that's just
no shop can afford that.
Exactly. So we're kind of in the middle of this battle with the FAA over this, and the results are not yet known, and we're hoping that they'll consent to have a meeting with industry. And virtually every alphabet group in industry now has signed on to this protest. AOPA, GAMA, ARSA, the Aeronautical Repair Station Association, AEA, the Aviation Electronics Association, EAA, I think I said AOPA already. Basically, everybody has gotten involved. We've even gotten Representative Sam Graves, who's the head of the Transportation Committee in Congress, upset about this, because we really are trying to mount a maximum pressure campaign to get the FAA to take this back and rethink it in a reasonable fashion.
So our next question is from Chip, who's picking up some weird vibrations. That makes me want to play a song somewhere.
Just don't sing.
Sorry, wrong descriptor there. What's up, Chip? Sorry.
Yeah, so we can call this the Beach Boys problem.
Yeah.
There you go.
I just had a couple things I wanted to ask you and clear up before I got deep into our question. It'll be quick. Do you guys remember some time ago you had a Piper Comanche, a caller call in, said his cylinder temperatures were too low? Do you remember that one? It was a while ago. And I was like, too low. I wish that was a problem I had. And he said his temperatures around 190 degrees. And I just installed my engine monitor system. I go, 190 degrees is centigrade is about 380 Fahrenheit. I'm going, I wonder if I just had the wrong setting. Was I reading it wrong? Because, anyway. But so I went through all that stuff, got my engine monitor set up real well. And so I'm a disciple of yours on that count. But a couple of Lena Peak misnomers I'd like you to clear up for me. And one of them was a mechanic of mine is not really on board with Lena Peak. He's coming around. And one of his concerns was the actual EGT while running Lena Peak at the exhaust valve itself is unknown. Therefore, you could do damage. I disagree because there's less fuel in the cylinder. So less fuel means less heat. But is there any, have you heard that concern before? Can you dispel that?
I don't understand the concept. Why is the exhaust gas temperature unknown?
He's saying the temperature at the valve might be damaging.
Valve itself, because we're measuring it a couple inches out the exhaust pipe. So he was saying, at the valve itself, you really don't know what the temperature is at the valve when you're running Lena Peak and you could burn a valve. I disagree.
But we do know that it's not peak. So it's less than peak. So when you're Lena Peak, it's less than where the manufacturer often tells you whatever it is.
I think that the even more important thing is that the temperature at the valve is not going to be anywhere near any temperature that's going to hurt the metal of the valve. The valve is designed, as long as it's dissipating the heat properly, it's not going to damage it.
Right. And I mean, the point is that exhaust valves don't burn because the combustion is too hot in any sense. Valves burn because they aren't properly heat sinked. In other words, that they can't shed their heat because, the temperature in the cylinder while the valve is closed is like insanely high. It's pushing 4,000 degrees, and the valve metal couldn't possibly withstand 4,000 degrees if it was allowed to get that hot. But the valve dissipates its heat to the cylinder head, which has all these cooling fins and dissipates the heat into the air. And valves burn when they stop getting heat sinked properly. And there's really two ways that the valves shed their heat. One is through the physical contact between the valve and the valve seat, which is in the cylinder head. And the other is through the valve stem with its interface to the valve guide, which is also in the cylinder head. Continental engines dissipate most of their heat through the seat, and Lycoming engines dissipate a lot more of the heat through the stem. About 50% of the heat gets dissipated through the stem because Lycomings have these sodium-filled valves that take heat from the face of the valve and move it up to the stem where it can be passed through the valve guide into the head. But the reason valves burn is because something goes wrong with that heat sink process, and the valve can't shed the heat that it's absorbing.
It's really hard to get across the concept to a class of owners that, except for the fact that they started the engine and ran it, there's nothing that they do in the operation of the engine, how it's leaned, what power settings you use. None of those things will cause a valve to leak or to burn.
Yeah.
And mechanics can't buy into that either. So it's just amazing how hard it is to convince.
I think it is the mechanic community that is guilty of trying to convince aircraft owners and pilots that anytime something goes wrong with a valve, it's got to be the pilot's fault. He wasn't leaning properly. Yeah. That's almost never the reason that the valve burns.
Yeah.
But pilots go around with all this paranoia about, if I do the wrong thing with the red knob, I'm going to burn the valve. And it
guilt.
Work that way.
There's guilt too.
Well, there's paranoia before they burn the valve, and then there's guilt after they burn the valve.
So that's such great news to hear, because that I'm a disciple of Lena Peak. I fly my airplane. It's a Commander, and I fly it from Florida to our home in North Carolina, and that's about as long as it can make it, Lena Peak, with a good reserve. So the only thing I suppose you can do then is above 65% power. Then if you're not leaning properly, Lena Peak, is you could cause detonation. That is probably the biggest risk. Is that true?
Well, if you're operating Lena Peak, it's almost impossible to get the engine to detonate when it's Lena Peak.
Okay.
But getting there, I think, is the concern.
The minimum detonation margin is 40 or 50 degrees on the rich side of peak.
Yeah. So if you pass through that area too slowly, you could cause detonation.
So that's why we recommend doing this maneuver called the big mixture pull, which is to make the transition between Richer Peak and Lena Peak rapidly.
Yeah, so I do the big pull, and every time I do, my wife says, "I don't like that."
Well, try to not
maybe you're pulling
too much.
Yeah, maybe you're pulling just a little too far.
Yeah.
So, what I'm doing, instead of being a geek and watching the upside down icicles and all that, I do the big pull. It's an IO 540, 260 horse, 8.5 gallons per hour, and I richen it till it runs as smooth as I think I can get it. And I make sure that the EGTs are still going up as I richen it, knowing that that gives me the idea I'm on the Lena Peak side. And then my litmus test is my cylinders in my airplane are considered cool below 380 degrees. Richer Peak, they're above 400 degrees a little bit. So if I'm running along 22 squared, about 22 squared, and I'm 380 or below, I feel like I've successfully and confidently am Lena Peak. Would you agree with the way I'm doing that?
Well, so I have a couple of things. One is, if your RPM and manifold pressure are the same, and I'm sure there's caveats to this, you don't need to do all the EGT thing. Just go to the fuel flow. It'll be the same fuel flow every time, just like the turbocharged engines do. When they take off, they get into cruise and they set 2,400, 2,300 RPM at 30 inches of manifold pressure, whatever they do. And with those two being the same on every flight, they can just lean to the same fuel flow they had last time they did, which might be, let's say, 16 gallons an hour, and they're lean to peak. And they don't have to do the lean find, waste all that time, which means more time in probable detonation area, and you're distracted from flying the airplane. That's the way I do it. And I would also fly not at 22 square. I fly wide open throttle all the time on my IO 550. And then I lean to get the power that I want. And I just make sure I get lean to peak.
So if you typically fly at the same altitude when you're going down to North Carolina and you always have the throttle all the way forward, just set the RPM you typically use and go for the fuel flow, and it should be the same each time.
It'll be the same fuel flow every time.
And I was kind of thrown out an arbitrary power setting, just to get the question across. But you got, as you become really intimately familiar with your engine, I want to reiterate what you just said, and I agree with you. I always look at the fuel flow and go, yep, that's about what it's always at when I do.
But just don't even use that as your first metrics to get to lean to peak. Just go to the fuel flow and you're done.
Okay, good. All right. If I still have time, the big question, and this is just driving us crazy, a Commander 1995 114B, I'm sensing vibration buffeting in the floorboard, mostly on the right side. I've had 4 mechanics look at it. 2 of them AIs who signed it off for the annual. I was with them. I trust them. They're great. I have a lot of confidence in them. And we cannot track down where there's buffeting and this vibration. I had another Commander on a ride with me, and he said, yep, you're not imagining this. There's a little bit of, there's something going on there. It's not drastic. And we just cannot figure it out. We've checked the muffler system twice, which was removed and replaced, which was removed to put gaskets in. And we also replaced the torque tube on the landing gear. So I'm trying to give you an idea of what major.
Is this lean to peak?
Awesome. No, this is a vibration question. It's really nothing to do with lean to peak. It's just
it sounds like exhaust.
Let me just start out by saying, I mean, in order to diagnose any problem, you have to gather data on the problem, and this is one that you're going to have to gather some data on.
Okay.
So the first question I would have is, how does this vibration or buffeting or whatever you've used various adjectives to describe it, but how does it respond to a change in RPM, and how does it respond to change in airspeed? Because first of all, we need to determine whether it's an engine vibration problem or whether it's some sort of an aeronautical a problem that has to do with airflow over something.
So I did do that, Mike, and so the center beam that comes down, in the cockpit to support the firewall, the rest of the fuselage, every flight I fly, I feel that, and I'm really in tune to the engine. The engine feels and sounds very smooth. The prop has been dynamically balanced right after the overhaul. And it definitely feels like it's coming from lower in the floorboard, and it gets a little worse when I level off. My next door neighbor and I, we were both former military. We did some formation flying, got some photographs, good look at the airplane. All the doors are closed tight. Nothing's shaking around.
Does it change with RPM?
So I fly at 2,400 RPM lean to peak because that seems to be where the engine runs smoothest lean to peak. And I haven't messed with the RPM yet. No.
But that's what Mike's talking about.
My recommendation is to do a test flight.
Yeah.
And to do a couple of things. One is to vary the RPM significantly and see whether the character of this vibration changes with RPM. If it does, then that would suggest that it's engine caused.
Yeah.
The other thing is to do vertical S's and change airspeed. and see whether this vibration varies with airspeed. And if that's the case, then that would be evidence that it has to do with an airflow over the airframe kind of a problem, whether it's a fairing that's vibrating, or there are all sorts of things that could be vibrating. But the first step in diagnosing this is to try to determine whether the problem is engine related or airflow related.
Okay, so vary RPM and notice if there's a difference, and that would indicate engine vibration problem. And then doing the climbing S. What do you call them? What was the name of that maneuver?
I called it a vertical S. I don't know if that's the proper, but climbing and descending,
slow and fast. Yeah,
slow the airspeed and then
without changing
increase the airspeed.
Okay, that's what a great suggestion. Okay, I do subscribe to your one of your maintenance services where if I'm stuck somewhere, I can call you and you give me
it's breakdown. Yep.
So is that a good avenue to follow up on this problem?
No, not unless you're
really.
broken down. It's meant to be AAA. So
you allow emails too. Could I email you, or what?
Oh,
In other
yeah.
words, follow up on this with you. What subscription would I need to do that?
Yeah, you can
QA.
email us.
yeah, well, you can always email Mike or any of us, really. I mean,
Yeah.
Okay.
first name dot last name at savvyaviation.com.
Okay. Well, gosh.
Or Chip, for that matter, you could email Ian and pose a question to all three of us that could possibly be discussed on a follow-up podcast. So
Yeah.
we do read the mailbag.
But again, the key here, and this is the key in any time you're diagnosing a problem, is that you need to gather data on the problem in order to determine what's going on. If it turns out to be engine related, the most likely reason for a vibration in the floorboards that is engine related is that something on the engine is contacting something on the airframe, where there's a vibration path that bypasses the shock mounts that on the engine, and we see that kind of problem happening all the time. But at this point, we don't know enough to know whether it's an engine-related vibration. It could be an airflow vibration, something having to do with the airflow over the airframe, over something attached to the airframe. So the first step in diagnosing this is to do a test flight and make a determination as to whether this is engine-related, which would vary with RPM, or whether it's airframe related, which would vary with airspeed.
My hat's off to you guys, because after talking to 4 experienced mechanics, no one suggested to do this in such a logical manner. I'm kind of going, I could have had a V8. Now, you're telling me that, gosh, this sounds so logical. Why didn't I think of this?
Well, what I've been saying for a long time is that mechanics are the surgeons of aviation. Okay, yeah. They take things apart and put them back together. Yeah. But most mechanics aren't really good at doing radiology and pathology and that sort of stuff, which is the diagnostic part of it. And that's sort of one of the areas that we sort of specialize in is doing diagnosis. And usually the diagnosis can be done remotely because basically all we're saying is let's gather data and then use that data to determine what the problem has to be.
So another few data points would be to look at when the problem started and what occurred before the problem started, like what maintenance may have been performed on the aircraft that may have created the beginning of something. And so you want to look back through the history of the airplane. When did you first notice it? Well, if it's always been there, have you flown other 114Bs to see if they feel the same way?
So no, I've flown other 114Bs, but I didn't look over and feel the floorboard, and wasn't. But the landing gear trunnion and the muffler system, those were done in close proximity time frame. And my memory's not that good, but it was around that time. So you're helping me narrow this down to look at least and what to do. So. All right.
Yeah, I mean, like for example, if the mufflers have hangers,
Yep.
like they do say in a Bonanza or something, if that stuff isn't set up right, that could be a vibration path
Because that's where the engine contacts the airframe.
Yeah,
Right.
it's got a spring hanger. That's it. One spring hanger. That's all it's got.
And is the muffler on the right side?
It is, sir. Yeah, we on the right.
So what you may be feeling are just the pulses coming from the muffler.
That's what I thought.
It may
Yeah,
be totally normal.
if you read his question, he's asking about roughness at lean of peak. And then the very next thing he
Well-
talks about is buffeting in the floorboards. And I feel lean of peak in my feet when I'm getting that cycle to cycle variation.
So, you know,
Yeah.
when you said
Yeah,
it
if-
first,
if-
that's why I asked if you were talking about lean of peak
Right.
or if you're talking about all the time, because that makes a big difference in the troubleshooting mindset.
So, Paul, are you suggesting that maybe like a tailpipe extension or something would make the vibration go away?
Well, maybe what is feeling is completely normal.
Yeah, completely normal.
For the airplane, because the exhaust pipe only comes out on the right side.
Yeah.
But it shouldn't be touching anything.
No,
And
it shouldn't be
But
touching
it's
anything unless it has
buffeting.
some,
It should be shock isolated with that spring
Right.
hanger.
but it could also just
the
be the
exhaust.
pulses of the
Right.
exhaust coming out of the exhaust.
Yep.
And you feeling that on the floorboard. I tend to fly with my shoes off. I don't really realize I'm doing it, but I can feel a lot of things with my shoes off that I don't feel with my shoes on.
I can feel it lean of peak.
Yeah. And when I
sure.
want vibrations to go away, I just put my shoes back on. And it's amazing how much better it runs.
Yeah.
Hey, Paul, next time you and I go flying together, would you please not take your shoes off?
Yeah, like on a 182, for instance,
Yeah.
the exhaust pipe comes out the right side, and it puts those exhaust pulses, on the right cow flap. It's really common for the hinges on the right cow flap to wear at about 2 or 3 times the rate as the left. And then the cow flap begins to vibrate, and that creates a vibration in the airplane.
Mhm.
So there's a lot to this. And to Mike's point, just flying around and saying it feels good, that's not enough data.
Okay.
You got to start thinking outside the box, which really isn't outside the box, but
Inside
if you're
the
not
box.
used to that
It's
mindset,
inside the right box.
you need to get in the right
Well,
box.
troubleshooting is about coming up with hypotheses about what's causing the problem and then collecting data to support or refute those hypotheses. So we gave you 2. We gave you airspeed and we gave you engine operation, and you can test conditions which test each one.
Oh,
Boy,
you got
that sounded amazingly scholarly the way
Just
you
like
said
a
that,
teacher.
Tully.
no, and it's awesome what you're telling me. I'll run at Rich a Peak to see if it's different, and Lean a Peak and the
Sure.
airspeed. I will say this: in the whole process of all this buffeting vibrations phenomena, the performance of the airplane is right out of the book. Nothing's changed, so it's not
Yeah.
like and out. Yeah.
Good.
Has nothing to do with that typically.
No. Okay. All right, guys. I'd love to follow up with you with this when I find out the answer. I think it's something we could circle back and everyone can maybe benefit from. If you're okay with that, I'll reach
Send
in when I answer.
perfect.
Yeah, reach out to
Yeah.
him. That'd be great.
Then we'll all get it. That'd be perfect.
All right.
Yep.
Thank you so much. Always
Yep.
appreciate you guys.
Thank you,
Okay.
Chip. Appreciate the call.
Yeah. Take care.
So long.
Bye. So our next question is from Frank, who's questioning the logic of his airplane's POH. Wait a minute. What kind of airplane is this?
It's a Luscombe.
A Luscombe. Does a Luscombe actually have a POH?
Yeah, it doesn't have an AFM, but it has a POH.
Well,
But since when was there ever any
Frank is-
logic in
it has an
POH?
operator's
right.
manual.
Oh,
Frank is
operator.
hesitating.
So go ahead. Let's hear
Yeah,
it.
go ahead, Frank.
Yeah, an
Sorry.
operator's manual.
Okay.
Yeah, a friend of mine purchased a Luscombe for me to teach his son how to fly. And as you've already noted, the Luscombe operator's manual is pretty dire
Thin.
in terms of any specificity. But it does say that on use of the carburetor heat, it should be full on for takeoffs. It is also placarded on the panel to use full carb heat on takeoffs. Of course, using carb heat for descents and low power settings as well. When I was at Oshkosh this year, I was talking with a fellow Luscombe owner, and he says the POH use of carb heat is intended to reduce power, thereby reducing pitch attitude, so as to ensure that the fuel takeout in the fuselage fuel tank remains covered at all times. That
is all insane.
That doesn't sound too.
That's complete
too real to
insanity.
me.
And the notion of using full carb heat for takeoff, if there was any possible rationale for that, which sounds very suspicious to me, the only possible rationale for that is not to reduce power, but to increase the richness of the mixture. That might have been for detonation concerns. But that's back in the day when we were running, 80 octane fuel, which you can't even get anymore. So if you're running this thing on 100 low lead, detonation is essentially a non-issue because the octane rating of the fuel is way, way higher than what the engine was certified for. And so any rationale for using carb heat on takeoff has gone away because you're using
that makes more
the
sense.
100 octane fuel. And what's even more crazy is the idea of using carb heat on the ground, which you should never ever do because you're basically breathing unfiltered air on the ground when there's all sorts of dirt and dust and stuff.
I couldn't come up with any. I've never heard this before, but I don't ever work on Luscombe's. But I was really struggling to come up with any rationale for using carb heat on the ground and at takeoff. I get the making it richer for a takeoff and initial climb. That I can put my head around that, but the rest of it makes no sense. And the unporting of the fuel port due to high angle of attack, there would have to be. I had a hard time even saying that with a straight face.
On fumes.
Yeah, I mean,
problem.
You couldn't. There's so many standard normal flight maneuvers you couldn't do. There'd have to be placards all over.
Yeah.
No up pitch more than 5.5 degrees or something.
So let me ask the question: this thing in the POH that says you're supposed to use full carb heat on the ground and for takeoff, where in the POH does it appear? Because the POH will have a section called operating limitations. And if it's in the operating limitations section, then theoretically it's mandatory. If it's in the normal procedures section or any other section of the manual other than operating limitations, then it's a mere suggestion and you're free to ignore it.
He's looking it up.
And this sounds like one that ought to be
what if
ignored.
it's like I said, it's placarded on the panel?
That doesn't matter. What matters is whether it's an operating limitation.
What if it's placarded on the panel? Oh,
It doesn't matter.
Yeah, the placard doesn't make it an operating limitation.
Okay, it's under
Just normal
it's under operating
procedures.
procedures.
Yeah, so it's not
so it's a mere
Yes.
suggestion. You don't have to pay attention to it, and it really doesn't make sense in today's world. It really doesn't. That
It does
engine
have
was
the
certified
STC for auto
on
fuel.
80 octane, I'm sure.
You said it has an STC for auto fuel?
Yeah.
And are you running it on auto fuel?
Yes, and we are. Yes.
But even with
ethanol-free
auto fuel, that's probably considerably higher octane than the fuel that the engine was certified for. I really don't think you have any detonation concerns.
Mike, is there no way to modernize a POH? I mean, is Luscombe even in existence anymore, or is anybody watching the hen house for these guys? I mean, since we don't even have 80 80 octane fuel, and that kind of makes this ancient, instructions. Are people just supposed to know?
The certification says, and the placards on the fuel filler port undoubtedly say minimum octane 80 or something like that, which means you can use higher octane than that.
But there's no way to update a POH as things change. I guess not.
I don't know. I mean, who would want to take that risk?
Yeah,
The liability risk of doing that is nuts.
But again, if it's not in the operating limitation section, which is the only part of that thing that's FAA approved, then it's not compulsory, and you can you can use common sense as opposed to slavishly doing what the POH says, I think. And
looking at Frank's question, it sounds like he kind of agrees with us when he wrote the question. He was like, "This seems kind of insane. What do you guys think?" So you were right, Frank. It is insane.
Yeah. Well, perhaps to be on the safe side, I should fly with my shoes off.
No.
Only when you're solo. Only when flying solo.
Just to be safe. That's right.
All right. Well, thank you, guys. I appreciate that very much, and appreciate your time taking my question.
Yeah.
Sure.
Good call.
Yeah, that was
question.
fun, Frank. Thanks.
Thank you.
So our next question is from Bill, who's wondering if there's truth in advertising, which I don't know if that's a joke, but go with that. We'll see what happens.
So I have a Cessna 180. It's on floats and operates in a marine environment and is stored in a marine environment. I have an 0470-50 engine in it, which is a modified engine for increased horsepower. And the engine runs just fine. I love it, and I've flown it pretty regularly until the last few months when I find I'm not flying it as much as I want to or should be. I mean, it used to be once a week. Now it's maybe every 2 weeks, and sometimes it goes to 3 or 4. So I'm interested in preserving the longevity of the engine, and one of the approaches that's been recommended is to use these engine dryer machines that basically at a low rate push dehumidified air into the engine crankcase with the idea that if you get below about 30% humidity, you won't have corrosion. And so you can buy these online. There are several you can buy. You can even make one on your own. And my question is there any real evidence that shows that these devices work?
When I read your question, I went online and just searched, and there are several people that sell these. There's different sites. And I read 2 or 3 detailed reports where they collected data. They did side-by-side testing. It seemed pretty extensive. Now, if what you're doing is you're reading what the manufacturer is saying, so take that with a grain of salt.
Of course.
But and there's an Aviation Consumer article that talks about the value of engine dehydrators and how they work, and how corrosion is the number one enemy of an engine's internals. Yeah. And it sounds to me that it's pretty data-driven and pretty simple, that is a good thing you could do for your engine.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of those things. And
really?
I remember years ago, Tanis wrote some stuff up on it, where they were having a lot of corrosion issues driven by people who were running their Tanis heaters all the time. And it was causing moist air to vaporize and then condense on something that was not being heated by the Tanis heater. And Continentals, it was typically the starter adapter shaft gear that would get all rusty. And they determined that it was okay to run the Tanis heater all the time if you also used an engine dehumidifier.
Wow.
So no, I think they're good. There are several different kinds available. There are some that simply use a small air pump, like an aquarium pump, to pump air through a chamber full of desiccant crystals, and then you periodically have to check the desiccant crystal thing, and when they start turning color, you've got to either replace them or you got to take them home and microwave them until they turn blue again. There's another kind that doesn't use desiccant crystals and uses refrigeration. It's something called a Black Max, I think.
Mm-hmm.
That it dehumidifies pretty much the same way a room dehumidifier works by chilling the air and getting the water out of it that way. And then there's another one that does use desiccant crystals, but it automatically reprocesses the desiccant when it starts getting full.
Is that the dry bot?
It's got a heater in it, and it's got a microprocessor in it and stuff. I think it's the most expensive and most sophisticated one. But there's a whole bunch of different ways of doing that now,
including making your own. There's instructions for making your own.
Yeah, I've got a customer in the Atlanta area with a P210 that has kind of made a career on designing his own, and it sends data to his phone, and he's been monitoring it. It is the coolest thing ever. He's got a YouTube video explaining how he has it all set up, and it's pretty cool. I think he's a member of Overthinkers Anonymous. Right? Oh yeah, he's definitely an Overthinker Anonymous guy.
Is he the guy that uses the aquarium pump?
Yes.
Yeah, I watched that.
I don't know if he's still using that, but that was,
But that's all you need. It's a low pressure pump that's just moving the air very quietly through and just passing it through a desiccant packet. That's the most simple, but that's very simple and something you could do.
When he rolls the airplane in the hangar, first thing he does pretty much is drop that down in his oil filler port.
Because when you put the airplane in the hangar after a flight, the crankcase is just full of moisture.
Yeah, crack open your oil filler tube and you'll see the steam coming out.
You hook this thing up and it basically pushes the moist air out of the engine and replaces it with dry air.
Well, this is great information.
Now the question is, if you have a float plane and it's sitting out there on floats, how do you get the extension cord out there to power the?
Yeah.
Oh, I've got shore power. So
There's shore power, Mike.
I can run an extension cord. It's real easy. That's not a problem. In fact, I use a dryer, whatever you call it, for the interior so that the electrical components stay dry.
Wow.
But
so you just have to learn how to hook the hose from the dehumidifier into the engine without falling off the floats and into the water, right?
Well, that is true. You have to, have reasonable balance. But if you're that unsteady on your feet, you probably shouldn't be flying.
Well, you got to practice your yoga, keep it up to date.
At least you shouldn't be flying float planes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The jungle gym.
It's a lot of fun. I live in the Seattle area, and so
wow.
That's really, it's a paradise for float planes. Really.
You get a lot of good use out of it.
That's wonderful.
And I take it up to Alaska every summer too.
Oh, you're killing me.
Oh yeah, fantastic. Lake Hood and stuff.
Oh, not that far. I go just to the Panhandle. So the Forest Service has these recreation cabins on remote lakes throughout Southeast Alaska. There's over 100 of these cabins.
Who knew?
Most are only accessible with a seaplane because there's no trails or roads into them, and they're fantastic. They're this single cabin on a single lake, and you have the whole place to yourself. They even supply boats, so you can row around the lake and fish.
Awesome.
And fish. Oh, awesome.
Are you based at or near Kenmore?
I'm at the other opposite from Kenmore. Kenmore's at the north end of the lake. I'm at the south end, closer to Renton Airport. But
Renton,
that going into those remote recreation cabins is really it's an incredible secret, and it shouldn't be because they're underutilized and they're managed by the Forest Service.
Well, we've now just broadcast it to a whole bunch of folks.
It's a good thing. I think the more people that use these, the more likely they are to remain.
Keep going.
Without people using them, they'll disappear.
Absolutely.
Well, that's really cool.
Wow. Sounds like fun.
Oh, it's a lot of fun. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. This has been very, very informative. I will say today was the most informative.
Oh, wow. What a zinger.
Okay. Ian,
It's
keep
only
that
uphill
in.
from here, though.
Bill,
No,
thanks
I
for
will-
calling. We appreciate you coming on.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Our next question is from Mark, who is pushing back on airport naysayers. Go ahead, Mark.
Well, I started flying back in the 70s. My first instructor had a PA-12, and he regularly used car gas. He'd come out with the 5-gallon can and the chamois and the funnel and dump it in the plane, and we'd go fly it. And then during the 70s and the 80s, I followed the EAA's auto fuel and alcohol fuel initiative. So when I finally got my planes running, I've got an old Aranca Chief with a 65 Continental. It's only got 200 hours on it since it was overhauled in 1970. And I've got a Cessna 175 with the GO 300 in it, which is a pretty vilified little engine, but I'm 300 hours over TBO with it. And the only time I've had problems with it was I had a stuck valve when I was running 100 low lead. So both of my planes are STC'd for running automotive fuel, no alcohol. And I've been following all the discussions recently about the UND planes that had valve seat recessions. And I was just kind of curious if it had ever been an issue with the older Continentals, since they didn't come out with the hardened seats until, 2018? So I was just kind of checking back on some of the stuff that had been mentioned in your program before about the new unleaded fuels. And is it going to be a problem on these older Continentals?
The short answer is no, it's not going to be a problem. And running your engine on unleaded MoGas, which apparently it's qualified to do, and you have the STC to do it.
Correct.
It's probably the best thing you could possibly do for the engine.
Well, I've got a lot of naysayers at our airport about that, but I kind of ignore them. They keep telling me that I have to run at least half low lead.
Yeah, that's just a real old wives' tale. We've never seen any problem with low compression engines running on unleaded MoGas.
Okay, one of the news groups I belong to, somebody mentioned that in the early days of the automotive fuel, that there were some reports that of valve seats welding, and that by using a little bit of 100 low lead at the start after an overhaul, you could mitigate those problems later. But I just was wondering about the old Continentals. So the other thing I've got is they keep telling me that at our altitude, we have a field elevation of 5,300 feet. And I use at least the 90 octane alcohol-free MoGas. And they keep telling me that it's going to be a vapor lock problem. And they know of quite a few people, but they can't tell me who've had vapor lock problems with the auto fuel. And I do have, let's see.
Well, we know tons of people who have vapor lock problems with 100 low lead. So
that's right. Yeah.
Well, the only time my Aranca ever did it was on 100 low lead. So, but I do have one of those. It's a Hodgson fuel tester. It sort of is a substitute vapor pressure tester. Have you ever seen one of those?
No. Sounds cool though.
Peterson's sold them with their STC years ago, and it's a little pressure gauge, and you pull up fuel out of the gas tank and put it under a vacuum, and you read pressure differential between no fuel in this little cylinder and fuel in this cylinder. So it's sort of a vapor pressure measuring device. And I've never seemed to have any problem with it, but I just wanted to see if you guys had any update on the valve seat problem and the 100 low lead problem with like the Barron project that I'm following.
Yeah, we've not seen any issues. I know there was a lot of bad information that came out of this UND decision to discontinue the use of the Swift 94. And we have some pretty strong evidence that the problem that was going on at UND was not related to the UL part, but was just related to the 94 part. Those were high compression engines, and they were pretty sure operating in light detonation when they were operated on the 94 octane fuel and lean to peak EGT, which is how they were operated during a cross country flight.
Okay. Well,
So you have a low compression engine. That there's absolutely no chance that you're going to run into a detonation problem.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, my 65 does have the high compression pistons in it that were allowed back a long time ago. So it's technically an 80. And I think it's got the high compression of like 6.3 to 1, which is
that's still
not.
That's pretty
really low.
compression.
Yeah, and my GO engine, I'm 300 hours over TBO on it.
And how many years?
Which I've put 300 hours on it since I bought it. So it was at TBO when I bought it. It was overhauled.
No, I mean, TBO is not just the flight time; it's also calendar time.
Calendar years. It was overhauled,
says
I
who?
believe, in 90. Well, we live in such a dry area, and I always pickle things if I'm going to leave them for a while.
Yeah.
But,
I mean,
the right way.
That's the whole point. Yeah.
Yes.
Anytime somebody says TBO, it's like, well, don't forget about the
Florida.
years. Oh, it's been 40 years. Well,
In
that's
Florida.
that component too. So
Yeah,
you're already
I'm starting,
past TBO. Why get
I'm
upset
starting
about
to
it now?
become convinced that we shouldn't call what we do general aviation. It's antique aviation, and we just
well, the one of your previous guests spoke about an engine that was no longer supported, and the GOs. I guess there's like 2 bushings in the gear reduction system that haven't been available for like 15 years. So when that goes, there's no replacement parts unless I take advantage of the orphaned engine thing and have the parts made.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Just owner produced bushings, no problem with that.
My sister has a Mooney Mustang that has the Lycoming TIO 541 and 310 horsepower turbocharged. It looks a lot like the Duke engine, but it has valve lifters, lifter bodies, not lifters, but lifter bodies that are completely unique to that specific engine. And there are no shops in existence that have approval to recondition, overhaul, or even repair the lifter bodies. And they do not exist new. So when those go bad, that engine is completely toast.
Well, I've been advised to shell out the $60,000 for a STC to put a Lycoming in it, or a Franklin, which could be worse.
What's wrong with the engine that's in it?
It's a GO 300, and it's got a 1,200-hour TBO on it.
Well, there's nothing wrong with either of those 2 statements.
But someday,
and I'd like to keep it. I've got a spare engine. The engine turns at 3,000 RPM.
Oh yeah, I'm very familiar. Yeah.
Yeah, they're great engines. They're smooth.
Sure.
And I fly another 175 that's got the Lycoming 4-cylinder in it that just vibrates like crazy. Yeah. So I like the O300s and the GO 300s because they are very smooth.
Well, keep flying it.
He will.
I plan. Actually,
nowadays, if you want to do an owner-produced bushing because there's none available, you sit down at your laptop computer, you pull up one shape or something like that. You create a 3D model of the bushing you want with the exact dimensions. You upload the file to a CNC shop, and a week later it shows up in the mail.
Yep.
Well, I do have several of
Amazing world.
the non-virtual 3D versions of the bushings that I took out of other engines, so I can use those as
So you can measure them.
a model. Like I can do that.
Mm-hmm.
But finding IAs that will sign off on something like that's kind of difficult, because
That's true.
my IA right now is over the Pacific somewhere, headed towards Australia with the firefighting C-130.
Oh, wow.
Okay, so after you create your owner produced bushing at the CNC shop, put it in a little plastic bag and staple an 8130-3 that you fill out to make it look authentic, and I bet nobody will ever question it. Just
well, let's call the AG.
I didn't say that, did I?
No, and I'm sitting here thinking you were questioning my discussion about running past 50 hours on an oil change. My goodness.
Well, I feel better about using the car gas in my plane. It sounds like this new AD that's coming out on the Piper wings is going to be an issue. And most of my students have got the Pipers. So
yeah,
sounds like you guys may have more questions on that. My fuel is fine. That's all I need to know. Okay, thank you.
All right.
Thank you for the question, and enjoy that 175.
Keep running that.
I really do.
In it.
Yeah,
I will.
That's a wrap on another Ask the A&Ps episode. I'm pretty sure we got a few things right this time around, but I'm also sure you're going to let us know if we didn't. Keep sending us your tricky questions. You can email us at podcasts@aopa.org.
See ya.
Bye, everybody.